everybody. Welcome to our final session of the conference. My name's Eddie Barnes. I'm the director of the John Smith Centre here at the University of Glasgow, which works with students and young people to inspire and encourage them to get involved in politics and public life. And as Jim says, I used to work for Our Scottish Future, hence the reason they brought me in this afternoon, rather. It feels like this evening to you.
I think it's past midnight, man. To be honest with you, I've had 2 hours sleep, but such is the power of Gordon Brown that if he asks you to do something, it's not optional. You just have to do it. So we're here.
Exactly. We're going to have, I think, talk up until about 4:30, and I will obviously open up for questions as well after I've asked a few of Douglas and Ash. So I think we should probably begin by saying congratulations on your victory last night. Oh, I see. I believe you've been giving the press humble pie, literally humble pie this afternoon. Is that right?
I mean, to be honest with you, it's probably the one campaign that I've been involved in my entire life where what the national mood music was and what was happening on the ground was absolutely alien to each other. And so I did take joy in saying that we proved the pollsters, the pundits, the commentators, and the bookies all wrong. And for those that are in the room that like betting, I hope we made some of you a few pounds in the by-election yesterday.
Tremendous. So you haven't been able to join us for understandable reasons for the conference today. And we've had a really fascinating discussion, taking in everything from clusters to the kind of future of higher education, to the need for a single industrial strategy, to the idea of growth zones, combined authorities, all quite high-level policy discussion around how we get economic growth. I'm guessing not much of that came up on the doorsteps of Hamilton, where you spent the last kind of 5 or 6 weeks. So just first question I ask is, how do you kind of straddle these big, high kind of, in today's politics, these kind of straddle where you're dealing with high-level policy at the same time as you're in this political world where attention these days is even more limited, news cycles last the morning. How do you manage to kind of communicate? How do you manage to deal with those two competing priorities in today's politics?
I think fundamentally it's all connected though, Eddie, isn't it? Because I think if there's one lesson we can take from not just a by-election, but actually the mood music of more general politics, is that people feel a sense of hopelessness right now. And that allows, I think, politicians who want to play on a sense of hopelessness and the politics of fear to push them towards some more divisive rhetoric and divisive political options. But ultimately, the reason why there's a sense of hopelessness and there is a general fear is that people feel as if things aren't working. And I think they're right to say that. It doesn't feel like the economy is working for people across the country. It doesn't feel like our public services are working for people across the country. We have a broken housing market. We have levers here for economic levers that we simply just don't use in Scotland. And we have to demonstrate how we aren't just going to tinker around the edges and through rhetoric alone say we're going to improve your lives. Actually, what I think Scotland requires is a fundamental rewiring of how we use our policy levers and economic levers to maximise the opportunities for people, and through maximising those opportunities, improve people's lives, and that then challenges the wider feeling of discontentment and disenfranchisement that the electorate faces. And Scotland's got vast powers in that sense. I think about, and I imagine it's already been mentioned here today, I think of my home city of Glasgow and broader Scotland, and I compare it a lot to, for example, Greater Manchester. Scotland has more levers than Manchester, has more resources than Greater Manchester, it has more innovation ideas and history than Greater Manchester, but we are not using our levers to maximum effect in the way that Greater Manchester is. And I think if we can use the industrial strategy of the UK to attract investment into Scotland, if we can align a Scottish industrial strategy that aligns with the UK government but is also bespoke for the individual regions within Scotland, and then we use the role of government, the powers of government, as well as the levers we have here, I think the opportunity here is immense. Genuinely, Scotland does not lack the talent. We do not lack the resources. We don't lack the credibility, the connection that people have to our people or to our land or to our history. What I think we lack is a political leadership and a political will to use it to maximum effect and maximum economic effect to improve the life chances of people. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the details of that in the conversation.
Well, let's just do that, and we'll get straight into some of the details, some of the policy ideas that have come out of today's conference. Douglas, maybe I could come to you first as the UK Government Minister of State for Trade Policy and Economic Security. So Dan Turner's paper that's been published today by Our Scottish Future, one of its main kind of recommendations is the idea of a single industrial strategy. And as you were just talking there about the need for an industrial strategy. It's a question to both of you, but Douglas, I'll come to you first, because I'm interested in how do you implement that when you have a UK and a Scottish government? Traditionally we've looked at the UK government, it's been talk about devolving and forgetting, not working perhaps collaboratively with Scottish government. You have a Scottish government that has its own internal culture, thinks of itself as very autonomous. So how does the UK government that you're a representative of kind of combat that when you're working across political divides to get to that single industrial strategy that has been recommended here at the conference?
So Eddie, firstly, thank you for the opportunity to be here in a rather more sunny and optimistic demeanour than we might have been otherwise. Frankly, in an era when politics and politicians gets a bad rap, I would just want to begin by paying tribute to Anas Sarwar. What we saw last night was the rejection of a politics of division, frankly at times a politics of bigotry from some on the campaign trail, that I cannot tell you how proud I am that the good people of Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse and the people of Scotland more generally rejected. And the fact they rejected it is in no small measure due to the leadership of this man. So I'm grateful for the chance to say that. This is a policy conference. This is a policy conference, not a political conference. So let me try and walk that line between politics and policy. Firstly, politically, as a government, we were elected back in July. We've got, huge representation here in Scotland in a way that, frankly, our predecessors did not. And so we have a huge amount of interest in finding ways of working together effectively between the Scottish Government and the UK Government. And the fact that we have so many Scots, not just in government, but in the House of Commons supporting that government, I think changes the dynamic from an era when, frankly, we saw a lot of performative disputes because it was judged to the mutual interests of the Scottish National Party and the Conservative Party to amp up the disagreements rather than emphasise what we share in common. So I think the politics is different. We've given expression to that by saying we wanted to reset the relationship within the United Kingdom, not just with the Scottish Government, but with the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish Executive as well. And that finds practical expression in a lot of contact and communications. So without betraying confidences from within government, I spent a good portion of yesterday in Hamilton with Ian Murray, the Secretary of State for Scotland. We stopped outside a Spar shop in Hamilton when he had a 25-minute call with Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister. There was no journalist anywhere near, it was a scheduled call, but it was indicative of the fact that even in the midst of political differences, there was a recognition by both governments that we had to find common ground in the interest of what was quite an important issue. More broadly, I think one of the challenges we face 25 years into devolution is that too often Holyrood has come to be perceived as a social policy parliament. And one of the reasons I'm excited when I look ahead to 2026 is the possibility that we can rebalance social policy with economic policy. And again, I think if you look at, it's been a very busy few weeks in the UK government. We've had a reset with the European Union, we've had a trade deal with the United States and a trade deal with India. We want the best of both worlds for Scotland, to be able to leverage the kind of reach that the British government has internationally. So if you look, for example, at the tariffs on whisky, we're going to get them from 140. India is the largest market with the highest tariffs in the world for whisky, and get those down to below 50%. Frankly, psychology and arithmetic matters in trade negotiations. If you are negotiating with the weight and scale of the United Kingdom behind you, you're frankly in a stronger position. But at the same time, we have to recognise that there's a lot that we should be doing internally, and the industrial strategy is that focus. We believe in open markets, but an active state. So in the coming weeks, just almost in the coming days, we will be publishing an industrial strategy that identifies 8 high-growth sectors, of which a number are significantly represented here in Scotland. That, frankly, is a different approach to the way industrial policy has been done historically. I grew up in the shadow of the Linwood car plant, where we were rewarding deprived communities with inward investment. We're very consciously saying we're going to build on successful sectors, and that's the way to be globally competitive. So I think the political will is there. That mutual respect is required at both ends. We need it in Edinburgh, and we also need it in London. But there is a sincere and genuine commitment that recognises, whether politically or critically in terms of policy, we have to work together. Frankly, if we're divided at home, we're much, much weaker abroad.
And the odds on you becoming First Minister have shortened a little bit in the last 12 hours. So if you are First Minister this time next year, how does it change in terms of your kind of strategy with regard to the way you work with the UK government? Or do you continue what's already happening?
I should say, first of all, that the Trade Minister was really subtle in saying he nailed 3 trade deals in a fortnight. So 3 trade deals with the US, India, and the EU. Well done, Douglas. Generally, an absolute service to businesses right across the whole of the UK, and significant for businesses here in Scotland. Look, there will be a fundamental reset, because I think reset is not just how we are with each other, but how we interact with each other. And there is still, despite good individual relationships when it comes to individual issues, we have got to be honest, there still remains a political tension at times. And there does still feel like the reflex position of a Scottish government is to find a reason to disagree rather than a reason to agree. And the 3 trade deals are a good example of that. Rather than welcoming the 3 trade deals and what they mean for Scotland, the initial position was find the reason why each of those trade deals somehow is bad for Scotland, when there clearly are good news for Scotland. So one is a more openness in terms of having that partnership. Second is joint project planning in terms of development of investable propositions. But actually, I think the fundamental difference will be how we view the role of government in Scotland. So Douglas has already touched upon this around being an economic policy first parliament rather than a social policy parliament. Our parliament and the Scottish government shouldn't think its role is purely to legislate and regulate. In actual fact, and I think there's been lots of examples of this in recent years, I think too often government thinks its only job when it comes to economic development is legislation and regulation. Actually, a lot of the time it is don't touch the regulation and legislation unless you want to declutter it. And there's other roles. And what I think the role of that is one, genuine partnership. And Scotland allows an opportunity to do it in a way that is harder, I think, for Westminster to do. Where how do you create genuine partnership? Our academia, our universities are a perfect example of that. Genuine partnership, one. Second is strategic pipeline planning of the future work that we want to do in terms of development in our country. And third, the most unused power, I think, of government is convening power. How do we knock heads together, get things done and get deals over the line and be deal makers? I don't think we do anything or anywhere near enough of that. I also think we have to get much more tight in terms of where we think the biggest opportunities for growth lie in Scotland. I'm just a strong believer that if any party or any government tells you it's got 100 priorities, it means it's got none. We have, I think, 4 very clear low-hanging fruit of economic growth in Scotland. That's not to say other sectors will be ignored, but the 4 that we should go hell for leather for are around energy, digital innovation in tech, Brand Scotland and tourism, and the great bridge between housing policy and economic policy and social policy is housing. That is the 4 areas of which we should make our key strategic opportunities for growth. And then how do we maximise the levers we have? Income tax, I think that's now becoming a barrier to growth and being used as a substitute to growth. Our planning legislation, our planning laws are not fit for purpose, and it actually pushes investment away rather than attracts investment. I don't think our licensing laws have caught up with the modern design of what a high street or a city centre or town centre has to look like. Our rate system is fundamentally broken. We don't support the small and medium-sized enterprise. Instead, I think it's more of a rigged system for the large distribution warehouses. Skills is wholly devolved. I think our skills system is still designed for an analogue age rather than a digital age. Our transport system, we are still far too disconnected as a country, but also disconnected within regions of Scotland. And then 2 final ones, regional economic development. We don't do that in any meaningful way. I think we still view Scotland as one kind of monolithic block, when in actual fact, a policy that works for Edinburgh is not going to be a policy that necessarily works for the Western Isles or the Highlands. And the final part then is our enterprise agencies, where I think it's far too cluttered and too bureaucracy heavy rather than using the weight of that money to actually attract investment. And a good example of that is, I think for far too many investments that are made by many of our enterprise agencies, I think they're going after projects more often than not that are going to be successful anyway, rather than finding the ones that need that little bit of nudge and amplification and investment that's going to get them over the line to get large scale. And I know that's an issue that's been discussed at this conference already. I think how we fundamentally reform our enterprise agencies too. That is 7 or 8 significant levers we have in Scotland that are now not currently being used to maximum effect.
I'm going to ask, I'll come back to that about that point around risk and regulation, because it's something that has come up in the conference. So, but just first of all, let's get into some of the detail of some of the things that we've discussed today. I mean, the conference has been looking at the question of innovation. How do we nurture innovation here in Scotland and across the UK? And one of the themes that's arisen, I think, is this question of startups to scale-ups. Now, Dan Turner's paper demonstrated that Scotland has more university spin-outs per capita than any other part of the UK. It's a phenomenal kind of seedbed, if you like, but that is not translating into scale-ups in the UK. And indeed, then you look at the UK as a whole, and as Saul Klein told us, we're kind of 30 billion a year light at the scale-up stage, if we look at what you'd expect from the amount of startups we have. So I'll just put it to both of you. Please choose whoever wants to go first. But what do you think are the policy levers that government can do, can pull in order to kind of change that, so that we see that, so we see more kind of startups actually turning into scale-ups and unicorns?
I should probably declare an interest in that. When the good people of Paisley decided in 2015 that I should become a private citizen again, one of the things I did was work with a major US investment firm looking at exactly these issues. And so frankly, the discipline of sitting in an investment review committee year in, year out, and recognizing the discipline with which globally mobile capital allocates that capital was an extraordinary education for me. And I spend a lot of time in government both trying to apply that domain knowledge and asking myself, how do we make sure not only that Scotland is deemed investable, but that we bridge exactly that gap between spin out and scale up? I can see Anton in the audience here. Of course, we have fantastic universities. I served for the last 4 years before July on the court of the University of Edinburgh, and whether it's Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews, or indeed Dundee or other universities, we are blessed by extraordinary primary research here in Scotland. Frankly, we have a weaker ecosystem in terms of the allocation of private capital to that public research than we should have. And As mentioned Manchester, one of the things I find dispiriting, if you look at the ecology and clusters around private equity, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, Glasgow was a peer competitor or ahead of Manchester. Manchester now has a deeper agglomeration of private equity capability than we do here in Glasgow. So that's somewhere else that we need to work. But also I think we need to have a sense as to the connections between Scotland and those markets internationally. I think about that all the time in terms of trade policy. There's really 4 numbers which are very easy to remember that I keep in my head after talking to Martin Wolf of the Financial Times about that. The European economy is growing at about 1%. The US economy is growing around 2%. The global economy is growing around 3%. And the Asian economy is growing around 4%. So if we want to actually lead in terms of innovation, we have to be connected to those global growth hubs. It used to be that the Chinese were coming to Europe in order to test themselves against the best in class. We increasingly need to look at the application of AI and other technologies in terms of where we should be building that capability. So I think global connections are part of it. Someone said to me recently, what you need to understand, Douglas, is that America innovates, China imitates, and Europe regulates, to Anas's point in terms of the risk of regulation. Now, DeepSeek would challenge that in terms of the Chinese capability for innovation, but we cannot say that we have a defining mission to grow the economy here in Scotland or in the UK and settle for a tax and regulation model. We need to be about how does the private sector dock effectively with the public sector in scaling those companies. And we need to be looking at first loss capital. We need to be looking at models in terms of the allocation of public and private capital together. We need to be encouraging entrepreneurship and the dignity of meeting a payroll at the end of every month. And at the same time, we need to be working to take what's a real capability, not just in primary research, but also in angel investing, up the value chain to growth investing. The kind of check sizes we were writing was about 50 million and above. That's exactly where a lot of Scottish companies check out rather than scale. And that's the challenge for not just the UK government, but for the Scottish government as well.
Yeah.
I won't repeat the points Douglas made. I wholeheartedly agree with all of them. Just to add a few things to it. One is we've got to have better use of public money and public capital. And I don't think we do that both in terms of our enterprise agencies, but also how we do, for example, the Scottish National Investment Bank. I think there's got to be greater partnership with those publicly available funds, both in terms of Scotland and the UK, to get that size and scale. We've also got to get much more relaxed about private sector investment in Scotland. I think there's a bit of an ideological block that private sector bad, public sector good. I think we've got to break out of that. Third, foreign direct investment is crucial, and we're in a global competition for foreign direct investment. And so we have got to be part of that global competition if we are going to get the money here. How we use our significant pension funds pots in terms of public sector pensions, I think, is also a huge proposition in terms of how we unlock investments, as well as greater partnership. Academia being, again, a good example. You mentioned Glasgow University. It's phenomenal things happening here. I'm not just saying that as an alum, but also because Anton's in the room, I've got to say that as well. But I think there's two cultural issues that we have to confront as a nation too. And I think the two cultural issues we have to confront is, one, I think we do have an education system that still ingrains in our kids' heads that the best they can ever aspire to do is grow up and work for someone, rather than grow up and build something and have people work for them. So we have to teach entrepreneurialism in our schools and make that part of our culture. And the second thing we have to do is we have got to stop the Scottish downsell. And the way I think about that is, I've got a lot of love and a lot of friends in the US, and one of the great things that American businesses is they are fantastic at upselling. They could have the most average product in the world, and they will go around the world saying this is the greatest thing you have ever seen, and encourage investment. You can have a Scottish entrepreneur that's got the best product in the world, and he or she will say, aye, it's all right. We have got to change that culture too. So those cultural pieces have to change, as well as what we do with that resource that comes from both private or public.
Eddie, can I just offer one build on what Anna said? When Bill Gates last came to Scotland to announce a significant investment from the Gates Foundation in the Roslin Institute, there was a small dinner he had that evening in Prestonfield House, and I was privileged enough to be invited. And in the course of that conversation, that is literally what Bill Gates said. He said, can I just offer you guys a word of advice? He said, I may be a philanthropist, but the reason I've just allocated this capital is not because I am charitable in the way I allocate capital. He said, if you weren't the best in the world, I wouldn't be making this investment, but nobody talks about yourself as if you've got some of the best primary science in the world. That was a very specific example recently in relation to the Roslin Institute, and there is a cultural challenge that we face. And on the issue of entrepreneurship, I grew up about 11 miles away from here. I went to my local comprehensive. I cannot think of a single person in my class who aspired to run a business. I can think of people who wanted to work in the compliance professions, who became a lawyer, who became an accountant, who might want to become a vet, but there was literally nobody who I can remember from my year saying, I want to set up my own business. And people generally wanted to go and work for IBM in Spango Valley, or another kind of job equivalent to that. So in that sense, I think education has a responsibility not just for science, but for the psychology of how we feel about entrepreneurship in the private sector. And frankly, there's a political point here. The last 10 years or so of British public life and Scottish public life, if we're honest, has been dominated by issues of culture, identity, and belonging. The most animating questions of our public life have been, who are we? Am I Scottish, or am I Scottish and also British? Am I British, or am I British and also European? Frankly, under the force of the long-term effects of the global financial crisis, where we are a high inequality, low growth, low productivity economy, or the invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, I think one of the reasons we were successful in winning the election back in July is that economics has made a comeback. And if you like, the exam question that the public are setting to politicians like ourselves is how do we raise the trend rate of growth of the UK economy? And if that's the question we're being asked, then politicians are part of the answer, but we need the wealth creators at the table as well. And it's frankly why I would pay tribute to Gordon and to our Scottish future. We need more conferences like this if we're going to get the politics right, but critically also get the policy right for what's a hugely competitive global situation.
Can I ask, as well as kind of selling ourselves better, one of the themes that's emerged from some of the speakers here, Kate Bingham, Chris van der Kuyl, was this question of attitudes to risk. And are we prepared to risk failure enough, if you like, if you can put it that way, in the way that government invests? You mentioned it already, and I saw is government just simply backing safe bets when in fact it should be going after things that may well fail and that you as politicians would then have to be held accountable for. I wonder if you could just talk us through the challenges there and the difficulties, the kind of dilemma you have when it comes to supporting, in Kate Bingham's case, it was a vaccine that when it was supported, we'd have no idea that it was going to actually work, but it was backed, it was fast-tracked. We seem to have regressed, as she says, to a system now where in the case of clinical trials, it takes a year in Britain for these to get done. In Spain, as she was saying, it takes a couple of weeks. How do you get out of this low-risk, high-regulation trap that seems to be stifling a lot of innovation, according to our speakers here?
I think a few things. One is it's about calculated risk, right? And every business will take calculated risks at any point in the development of their business and the advancement of their business. And the exact same approach, I think, has to apply to how we use investment pots and how we operate with entrepreneurs in the country. Secondly, I actually think the public mood has quite significantly shifted. And what I mean by that is, I think if we go into any election or come out of any election where all we're kind of doing is having an auction on who's promising X number of nurses, who's promising X number of police officers, who's promising X number of this, to be honest, I think it misses where the public mood is at. I think where the public mood is right now is they want not sticky plasters, they want proper big thinking, big change. And even if that means risk, as long as they know what the outcome of that risk is and what the destination of that risk is, and they can see what that outcome is, I think they'll be more willing to accept it. And that's a challenge for a UK Labour government. It's also a challenge for us as we think about the election next year. And then the other point is, I think one of the reasons why we don't take the calculated risks in Scotland, and Douglas, we were able to judge in terms of UK departments, is I think the other challenge we have is we have a people problem. And I don't mean that we don't have the talent and we don't have the people in the nation. I don't have an ultimate confidence that we are using the brightest and the best to help us shape what that public policy outlook looks like. And one of the areas that I'm really keen to explore, and it taps into what Douglas said around conferences like this and the people that come to conferences like this, is there's lots of people who want to help, want to give their expertise, want to share their knowledge, want to improve our country, but they don't want to be politicians. They don't want to be civil servants. They don't want to be special advisors, but they're willing to contribute their time, their energy, and their knowledge. How do we create a way that government uses those skills and those talents appropriately, whether it's set projects, whether it's set periods of times? I don't mean like Elon Musk, I mean other ways than that, to actually go for the outcomes, and you use the expertise that exists across the country to make that a reality. And that's one of the areas we're looking at too, is not just what our message needs to be in the election, not just what our policy platform needs to be, we're also proactively looking at, forget the politics of it, forget the party politics of it, where are the people and in what sectors that we can get them in to help us deliver this? Because regardless of what anyone's politics might be, we all have an equal stake in getting this right, because it's the future for our country and the future for the next generation.
I don't know if we want to open up to questions. I'm sure people would love to ask a bunch of questions. I think we've got 10 minutes left. So yes, I think that's a yes. So why don't you come down to the front first, because I think the people at the front here were fastest on the trigger.
It's not a question.
And it's questions, I would
It's a
say.
short point or a plea. Anna's talked about education for entrepreneurship. Good idea. But our school system isn't working at the minute. It's been neglected for well over a decade. It's running down. I used to be a teacher. The teachers are working flat out, but they are not able to deliver the results. We need a fundamental look at the education system. It's actually the most important function the Scottish Government has for the long-term future of our country.
Thank you.
And it's the worst SNP failure in a highly competitive field.
Do you want to...
Thank you. I think you painted a very nice positive picture in terms of what the entrepreneurial vision for Scotland or the UK would look like. And I suppose that should be entrepreneurs' heaven. The question that I'm thinking about is, that was the decision about in June or July, that it's a very pro-business environment. What do you think is the economic opportunity for those challenges of talent or people that we are facing, as well as the rhetoric that it's what levers can Scotland pull? And I'm sure you can think about as creatively as possible to attract people here and for businesses to base here compared to everywhere else, because we have 65% people over 65, so naturally our demographic is going to get older. There's already less tax in the economy, but that doesn't mean that there is so much vast potential for that, so we can attract business here. So I think what I'm hinting at here is what are your thoughts in terms of tax issues, both income tax, but at the same time corporation tax, and people migration, and there are creativity because it's a relation to where there are less people, because to be frank, there are people who wish to move to Southeast but not here. So thoughts on that, because that would be the critical mass for businesses.
Thank you. Yes. First of all, on the point of, we could talk all afternoon about education, but there are some fundamentals in our education system that we have to shift the culture on. I mentioned entrepreneurship being one. The second one is we don't teach our kids financial literacy. We don't teach them around how to save, how to borrow, around mortgages, around interest rates, all of which is a huge, given our large-scale financial services we have in our country, we don't teach our kids those basic financial literacy skills, which I think are also really important. Third, the future of every single business, give or take one or two, and also the future of our public services are around digital and innovation. We still have an analog education system. We don't embed those digital skills in every single kid that goes through our schools, which again is a fundamental flaw. Fourth, we have a massive challenge in our schools where the number of kids that have assisted support needs is rapidly rising. We now have 41% of children classed as having additional support needs, at the same time that the number of assisted support needs teachers has fallen by a third, and class sizes have increased in size. And what that means is you've got an existing workforce that's exhausted, doesn't feel supported, doesn't feel it has the resources. You have a larger class size group, and 2 or 3 heavily disruptive pupils can occupy almost all the time of that teacher. And that means those kids that might just need that extra bit of nudge from their teacher, that little bit of extra time, don't get it, and therefore don't get the outcomes they need, and that impacts on them for the rest of their life. So that absolutely needs a fundamental redesign, as well as pupils and teachers feeling safe in the classrooms because they don't feel safe. And so the system, you're right, sir, is absolutely broken, and we have to address every single part of that if we are to build an education system fit for the future. And to Poonam's question around talent, it's partly around income tax, and we have got an income tax challenge here in Scotland. It's not as simple as just equalise the income tax rates across the UK, although the principle sounds good in practice. And the reason why it's not as simple as it is because I think the top rates of tax are too excessive and are driving away opportunity and are being used as a substitute for growth. Any government that gets independent analysis that says over 90% of what you're saying you're going to raise is going to be lost because of behaviour change, and they still go through with a change, even though it's only going to raise, I think, £7 million, although it hasn't raised that, I think just shows it's the wrong form of how you do tax policy. You then got the rate below that, which the differential tax rate is so huge that you're pushing talents to go to work in other parts of the country rather than come to Scotland is, of course, also a challenge for us, particularly when you think that the fiscal framework is designed by the number of people and the size of the median wage. We have to drive up wages and the number of people earning that median wage in Scotland if we are to drive up investment in our broader public services. So tax is one part. Corporation tax is another one, but to be honest, I don't support having a separate corporation tax system in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK, because I think all that risks is a race to the bottom. I think that if there is one area to explore with corporation tax is whether you can look at sectoral corporation tax rates, which are about the industrial strategy and how you can drive investment. But that's, of course, got broader considerations that have to be taken into account. But there's other incentives that we can give to businesses to headquarter here and to bring talent here. One is, of course, the income tax. Second is what we do with our rate system. Third is financial opportunities that exist around our enterprise agencies and our investment propositions, but also how you give them genuine partnership and the conditions that exist for us to come here. Two practical examples of that is we have 2 ready-made sites for SMRs, small modular reactors, nuclear power in our country, but we have an ideological block to nuclear energy in Scotland, which means the billions of pounds of investment and the thousands of jobs go elsewhere. They should be coming here. And secondly, when it comes to AI and data centres, we have the climate and the excess energy that exists in certain parts of the country to make it attractive for those projects to come here too, but we're not making them right now investable propositions. That's just 2 examples of how we can attract more investment and jobs here in Scotland.
Douglas.
Just make 2 quick points. Firstly, on education, I think devolution 25 years on will have matured when we occasionally look south of the border and say, do you know something? England's doing this better than us and we should steal what they're doing. And arguably, the most successful public policy intervention in the last 25 years has been the turnaround of state education in England. We've gone from a situation where ILEA, Inner London Education Authority, was a byword for catastrophically bad education, to London schools having the best results anywhere in England, often notwithstanding there is significant levels of deprivation in London. And in that sense, we have a huge responsibility to learn some of the key lessons. And one of the most exciting lessons for a progressive politician like me is that the route to educational excellence turned out to be leadership and not selection. And in that sense, the quality of our head teachers in Scotland is, to my mind, the critical success factor in terms of what happens in the classroom and what happens beyond. Secondly, and this is a more challenging point, we are delivering more outstanding graduates from Scottish universities than we are at the moment generating graduate jobs for those graduates. My son graduated from Edinburgh University, I dare to say, in this room back in July. If you look at his friendship group and what proportion of those really talented kids who have graduated from Edinburgh University do not have graduate level jobs a year after they graduated, we have a genuine and chronic crisis in terms of what happens to some of our outstanding graduates after they graduate, and that requires the private sector to lean in, because that's not going to be solved alone by the public sector. Final point I would make, if we are serious as we need to be about social mobility as well as educational excellence, one of the ways that I think I failed as the MP for Paisley between 1997 and 2015 was at the end of my time in office, Paisley was still a community that lived more on its memories than on its dreams. We knew what we were as a community in Renfrewshire in the 1950s or in the 1850s, but we remained uncertain about our place in the 21st century economy. And we are up against a lot of politicians right now who are weaponizing nostalgia and the past. Take back control, make America great again. Back and again are the 2 most powerful words in those lines. So actually, we need to get back into the future business of convincing graduates, apprentices, young Scots that they can build a life and have a future in Scotland, rather than a sense that the future is going to be happening somewhere else. And that, again, cannot be done by government without the support of the wealth creators and the entrepreneurs in our society.
I'm going to, because we're running out of time, what I'm going to suggest is we do 3 questions, and Ass and Douglas can ignore the ones they don't want to answer and pick and choose which ones they want to do. So why don't we just go for 3? So Dina, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, Eddie. Dina Tessera, Aberdeen City Council, Labour Councillor and Energy Spokesperson for Aberdeen Labour, and an advisor for Our Scottish Future. First of all, congratulations for the result of the election yesterday. I was there campaigning with you, so I know how hard we worked, and also Eid Mubarak as well. My question is, Aberdeen is often portrayed as the energy capital of Europe. However, we read in the Press and Journal a couple of days ago that oil and gas jobs may be reducing at 400 jobs per fortnight. So what is your answer to retaining jobs whilst moving into net zero?
Okay, so that's retaining jobs in the North East. Yeah, sorry. Do you want to just, sorry.
So Dan Coleman, economist at Deloitte. The industrial strategy sounds really promising, and you're both right to be saying that we have to back our strengths, key sectors like green energy, life sciences, tech. But I'm wondering how are you going to ensure that the economic benefits that flow from that don't just stay in urban hubs, but go to all parts of Scotland?
So that was a question about how do we spread the economic benefits of clusters and so on, and then the gentleman right at the back there, one last.
If I can quote the famous Yogi Berra, this is déjà vu all over again. Scotland has been agonising about the low level of entrepreneurship for decades. Can I remind people, in 1993, Scotland set up the Scottish Business Birth Rate, a hugely innovative policy programme set up by Crawford Beveridge, a Scot who had worked in Silicon Valley, built up Sun Microsystems, came back to Scottish enterprise. What he noticed in Scotland was how low the level of entrepreneurial activity was. That very innovative scheme was destroyed within 10 years. His successor had a different agenda. It was taken over by folk who thought that the only type of entrepreneurship that mattered was high growth entrepreneurship. So one thing I would, and that's sending out signals. All entrepreneurship matters, not just the high-tech entrepreneur. So one thing I would say, reinvent the Scottish business birth rate.
Right. Which one of those would you like? Which one of you would like to take some of those questions? Maybe you start with the North East and the question that Dina
I didn't
asked.
want to make the gentleman feel his age, but I was born in 1983, so I was 10 in 1993. So I'll need to go back and look at that, sir, and see if that's something that we can replicate it. That's one of the go back and again points that Douglas was making. But on the broader point, it's not just tech entrepreneurs, actually entrepreneurs right across the board. And if you actually think about our town centres and our high streets, and I spent a lot of time in Hamilton Town Centre in the last 6 or 7 weeks, if you are going to make our town centres and high streets thrive again, then that is going to require boutique retail stores, as well as a different approach to hospitality, and that is entrepreneurship too. And how you have a rate system and a planning system and a licensing system that operates, as well as proper housing market, so you have the footfall, is the only way we're going to reinvigorate our high streets and our town centres. On the point about regional, I think it's right for us to have a national growth plan. But I think within the national growth plan, you have to have regional growth plans too, that brings together the partnership, but also recognises what the key drivers are in those individual regions. And Scotland is a perfect example of that. Our economic options and opportunities in the west of Scotland are very different, for example, from the Highlands and Islands. That doesn't make theirs any less significant, but how you have the right approach and levers in those individual parts is going to be really crucial. And on the energy policy point, I think one of the great frustrations over recent months is, I think, given some of the rhetoric of some of the parties, it's almost a pretense that it's an either or, when actually we need to have both. We need to have a holistic energy policy that recognises the significant role of oil and gas, that continues to make it an investable proposition. And I can say this because I'm not in government. Perhaps Douglas will have to be a bit more coy about these things. We have to maintain our commitment on we said we would honour the licences pre a Labour government. We have to honour that commitment. I think we do have to look at the fiscal position to make it a more attractive, investable proposition. Because even if you have granting of licences, unless you make them investable propositions, people aren't going to invest in them, and you then won't get the fruits from those investments. Third, a large part of the investments that need to come in the renewables future have to come from those companies that currently work in oil and gas, because they are the ones that are going to make a large part of the contribution to the large-scale investments. And then we have to ramp up the investments and get the jobs. And if you're going to match the large-scale jobs that come from oil and gas in the renewable sector, then we've also got to be honest and say those large-scale jobs largely come from the supply chains, and currently the supply chains don't exist here in any meaningful way. We have to upgrade our ports, because that's where large-scale jobs come from. We have to end the ideological block on nuclear, because again, there are large-scale jobs associated with that. And we have to make sure the renewables opportunity just isn't viewed as a northeast opportunity or a coastal opportunity, but it's an opportunity for urban and rural communities in every part of Scotland, and there's therefore job opportunities in every part of Scotland too.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up there, and apologies for those
sorry,
of you
Douglas.
who didn't ask.
Sorry.
And Ashley, the last word.
No, please.
You get an extra bit of...
I would just make a couple of quick points. One on regional policy. I feel this very acutely. Glasgow is the city of my birth. I represented Renfrewshire for 18 years. I now have the privilege of representing East Lothian. We are watching, unless we have active public policy intervention, the Scottish economy tipping from west to east. If you look at, we are an 81% services-based economy in the UK now, and while we have great strengths in terms of hospitality and energy, we need to be actively pursuing a strategy that recognises that broadly we have a city-region economy internationally, which are the principal drivers of global economic growth. We need to leverage that effectively and then figure out what that means for every region of Scotland. So why is East Lothian doing well in terms of its population rising, not the depopulation we're witnessing in North Ayrshire, Central Ayrshire or in Inverclyde? Partly because of a halo effect from Edinburgh, partly because it's tapped into some of the most dynamic sectors of modern Scottish economic life. And in that sense, we do need to see, how do we improve the infrastructure? How do we strengthen the skills? How do we get connective membrane between where we have productive aspects of the economy and populations that are frankly not going to move? And in that sense, we need an honesty and a humility in saying there is going to be, if you like, challenges for public policymakers connecting that growth with where people live in a way that frankly has not been the hallmark of recent years in Scotland.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry we're going to have to end there. If that was an Aston Douglas on 2 hours sleep, I think you'll agree that we're probably in good stead for the next year, given I hope you get some rest this weekend. I'm going to pass over for the closing comments to Jim Kelly.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've had a fascinating day, and I've had a fascinating day, and that was an excellent end to it. Thank you both very much. Occasionally, when they're not in the room, we mad-mouth politicians, but not today. And certainly not after listening to these two. At this stage of the day, there are only two sets of things to be said. The first one's quite obvious, and that's a set of thanks to those who have inspired this conference, those who have organised this conference, to those who have delivered this conference, and those who have spoken at this conference. And I'm not going to list every one. The second thing is addressed to you. And the first thing is to thank you for coming, which is obvious, even those of you who have gone. But more important, there is, in this conversation, it's perfectly plain that there is a common sense of direction as to what we need to do next. There may be disagreement about detail, maybe challenges here and there, but there's a common sense of direction about developing our economy, and particularly, actually, if I may say so, on the point on which Douglas concluded that geography matters. Where things happen is really, really important. All the evidence says that's how you build your economy, that's how you build the kind of clusters we've been talking about, and you have to do this on a coherent and strategic basis. That's a challenge for governments, and it's great to hear that governments are now working much better together, but it's a challenge for all of us as well. We have to ask ourselves, in our professional and indeed our personal lives, what are we going to do to push this kind of agenda forward? Because governments don't make wealth, governments don't create economies, people do. And we need, as governments, to create the circumstances, but we, as the population, need to take advantage of them. Our Scottish Future will continue to pursue this, as other agendas, But as the man used to say in the television, this time it's chiefly yourselves. Thank you all very much indeed.